So you'll be using this machine a lot this year. This is called the bandsaw. If you look carefully here, you'll see that there's two big wheels, very creatively called the upper wheel and the lower wheel. And stretched around these two wheels is a metal band. This metal band right here goes around both of these, and on this front edge of the metal band are the teeth. So as it comes around like this, the teeth are traveling down towards the table right here. These teeth will do the cutting of materials, mostly wood, but it can cut plastic and other stuff. The bandsaw is really handy because the teeth have a set to them where they're bent a little bit to one side or the other. And in effect, that means that the amount of wood that's being cut away, the kerf of the wood, is actually wider than the blade itself. So that as you feed the wood in, you can either cut straight through the piece of wood with the bandsaw blade, or you can actually start to turn the wood as you're cutting and make a curved cut. It's very helpful. In order for you to use this machine, you'll have to pass a safety test, and you'll have to know several parts of the machine. So starting with the big parts, we've got the upper wheel and the lower wheel, as I mentioned before, the blade, the upper wheel guard, lower wheel guard, these big guys here, which of course stay closed all the time that you're operating the machine. For now, we can see this part here is just called a blade guard, and that moves up and down as we adjust the height. This whole assembly here is the blade guide, and that's going to have the two blocks there that hold the blade straight, because the blade has a tendency to flex to one side or the other as you're putting force against it when you're cutting material. So this part here helps hold that steady. Now the thing is, we can see when we've got the blade guard and the guide raised up to its highest position, there's a lot of blade exposed here. Probably 6 or 8 inches of blade exposed right here. If you're only cutting a piece of wood that's 3/4 of an inch thick or 1/2 of an inch thick, there's no advantage to having this much blade exposed, and it simply means there's that much more room for you to get hurt. If you get your fingers up against this blade as it's moving, it's going to cut you pretty easily and pretty quickly. One of the things to keep in mind when you're using machines is that when something goes wrong, if the blade, if you slip, your hand slips, or some other little piece comes flying out, it happens very fast. There's no time to dodge the bullet like Superman, right? So what you have to have is good practice and good habits so that you're wearing protective gear like you should be, so that your hands are in the right place. If something comes out, it's not going to hurt your hands, or it's going to be very minimal, kind of like a little scratch or whatever. Most people go through the entire year without any injuries at all. If we do have people that get hurt, well, usually it's just a little tiny scratch or whatever. No big deal. We have Band-Aids for that. But this machine has a potential to hurt people very badly, and so you have to be very careful as you use it. Okay, so let's see. This big part here, very obviously called the table, and this table is actually called a tilting table because we can loosen a couple of clamps here and tilt the table this way, and if we have a piece of material we're running through the blade like that, it's going to make an angled cut on the piece of wood, or a beveled cut. This little guy in the middle here, called the table insert, right there, and the blade guides we mentioned before. This roller right here, if you can see this, there's a round bearing right here. That's called a thrust bearing. So as the blade gets pushed backwards, it's going to spin against that roller and not have a lot of friction. So we'll keep these tight while we're using the machine, and we'll adjust the blade so that it is, when you're using it, the blade should never be more than a 1/4 to an 1/8 of an inch above the surface of the material. So if this is a 3/4 inch piece of wood, that guard, the blade guide, should never be more than 1/4 of an inch above this or an inch above the table, so that we need enough clearance for the wood to be able to slide through, but we don't want excess clearance or excess space that exposes us to more danger than is absolutely necessary. We cannot make the machine risk-free. Obviously, there's no such thing as a safe machine. That's a machine you never use. But we can minimize the risk. We can manage the risk. And as long as you're following the rules and being mindful of what you're doing, it should be no problem. Now, as I'm pushing a piece of wood into this machine, I have to be conscious of where my hands are. Even if I'm following all the other rules, if I manage to just run my hand right into the blade, I'm going to get cut. So what I'm going to do is to make sure that my hands, as I'm pushing the piece of wood in, keep my hands off to the side, to one side or the other, so that they're never lined up with the blade and heading that way. If I do slip, or if the piece of wood suddenly moves one way or the other, there's plenty of room for my hands to miss hitting the blade. Okay, so let's try cutting this piece of wood. Before I do that, like with all machines, I'm going to make sure I don't have any loose clothing, no jewelry, no secure my hair back if I've got long hair, and I'm going to put on my industrial duty safety glasses and make sure that's in place. Clearly the eyes are the most vulnerable thing, so we want to be sure that we're protecting them at all times. In this case, I'm just going to make a simple cut on the end of this piece of wood. You might have marked it off with a ruler. Okay, and when I look at this piece of wood, I'm going to say, well, this is the good piece I want over here. This part over here is the waste. So as I'm cutting along this line, I'm going to try to kind of hit right at the edge of the line, or kind of split the line down the middle, but have the blade cutting to the waste side of the line. So it's taking away the material from the part that I don't want anyways. So I'll line this up here. Make sure my blade guide is adjusted to the proper height. Start button here. Notice the stop button is very prominent. It's really easy to hit this. When I go to start it, I have to reach inside this little plastic guard here to hit the start button. So we'll start it up. We're going to let it come up to full speed. It only takes a second, but make sure it's already at full speed before you start putting the material into the cutting blade. Now, a lot of times I want to clear away this piece of wood from the blade after I've done my cut. But I'm waiting until this blade comes to a complete stop. I can hear it continuing, its momentum continuing to carry it for several seconds after I've hit the stop switch. So I want to make sure that I let it come to a complete stop before I reach up here and try to move this small piece away from it, right? And that will happen a lot if you're doing some fine cutting. You get a lot of little pieces. Sometimes those pieces get down into the groove here with the table insert, try to jam up your progress. Don't get anxious and reach in there while the blade is still moving. If you need to clear scraps away, shut it off, take the extra 5 or 10 seconds, wait for it to come to a stop, and then clear those things away and you can continue cutting. But you can see here, without too much effort, I was able to cut along that line and cut the piece of wood the way I wanted. Okay, thanks for listening. I'll be sure you remember those important points.